When a storm arrives, there's always a chance for a flash flood to emerge. In this presentation, I will explain a study in which we found the determining factors for flash floods to occur. Sorry, fell a little bit. I worked with Greg Tucker's series. Before I reveal these contributing factors of flash flood occurrence to you, I'm going to go over the components of a flash flood. So during a rainstorm, rain falls into the soil until the soil cannot hold any more rain, which it reaches its maximum infiltration capacity. So once it reaches its infiltration capacity, the remaining rainfall falls onto the surface, but it creates a runoff. And when the runoff is sufficient enough, then it's a flash flood. Also, if a rainstorm occurs after a period of some dryness, a seal tends to form, and the seal is impermeable. So instead of infiltrating the soil, rain bounces off this impermeable seal and turns into runoff. Floods are water rising in response to storms. So flash flood can be related to, or typically associated with, convective precipitation, so thunderstorms. Living in Boulder, we know thunderstorms appear out of nowhere. So flash floods are the exact same, and they occur with very little warning. So they're very dangerous and are the main drivers for gully erosion in semi-arid environments. And here's a picture of a crazy flash flood in Arizona a couple of years ago, and also in Arizona a couple days ago with a tipped-over bus. So why should we care about rapid gully erosion from flash flooding? Well, for one, sediment loads that are eroded from the previously stable surfaces so head cuts form from these flash floods eroding into these surfaces, and sediment is released, and this can contaminate water supplies. And also, agricultural lands are extremely dangerous because when they are eroded, the chemicals can be released into water supplies, which makes it dangerous and not good to drink. So we need a general flash flood reference model to figure out why flash floods happen. My big question is, what are the necessary contributing conditions necessary for a flash flood to emerge? And my hypothesis was rainfall intensity coupled with duration and antecedent soil moisture. West Bijou Creek is a great example of a dryland zone heavily impacted by gully erosion. It's located in central Colorado. So here it is in reference to Denver, just east of that. And it's composed of poorly lithified sandstones, mudstones, and lignites, making it extremely susceptible to erosion by flash floods. And I'm going to focus in on this picture. We have a difference infiltrometer site that's right here, which was a short-term study where we set up two difference infiltrometers, one on a bare plot of land and one on a vegetated plot of land to measure the difference in infiltration rate. And then we have a sonic sensor stage site set up right here, which is a longer-term 6-year study on water depth, height, and stage height. And yeah. So I mentioned the data collection and analysis. There is a sonic sensor that's placed approximately a meter above the ground, and it measures water depth during a flash flood. And it's connected to this tipping bucket rain gauge that measures water every 1/100th of a centimeter. And it communicates via data logger with this sonic sensor. And the sonic sensor records every 20 seconds for 3 hours following any of these bucket tips. And I'm going to point out this flash flood hydrograph where it's water surface height versus time since the start of the storm. And flash floods are pretty easy to find in huge data sets because they are commonly characterized by this sharp ascension in water depth height. So this one reaches almost 25 centimeters. And then the water slowly recedes back to nothing. So flash flood hydrograph that I found in the 6-year data. I was also able to graph all of these storms. So these diamonds represent flash floods, and these squares represent no flash floods, and the triangles, there's some ambiguity in my data. So I drew this threshold curve, and what that means is that basically everything above this curve is a flash flood, and everything below this curve is not a flash flood. So at a peak intensity of 15 minutes, that means that, so for the storm running for 15 minutes, it's the highest rain intensity that was recorded in that whole 15-minute span. And so each one of these points represents a peak intensity of a rainstorm at 15 minutes. This threshold curve kind of starts around 30, 35 millimeters an hour, which, to put in perspective, heavy rain is generally 15 to 20 millimeters an hour. So that's pretty intense rain right there that needs to happen. Likewise, if the storm is reaching about 15, 20 hours, all it needs to do is just rain for a long time at like 2 to 5 centimeters or millimeters an hour. And the same thing can be said for half an hour. So at 30 minutes, the highest intensity recorded for the 30-minute time interval shows 20 millimeters instead of 30 because it's a longer time interval, and has to occur also for a long duration to produce a flash flood. At the difference infiltrometer site, we have two infiltrometers set up. These were created by John Moody of Boulder at the USGS. Pretty neat. Vegetated plot, it's about 0.6 square meters big for each of them. And one is on a vegetated plot, one's on a bare plot, same slope, so that's not a problem. So when water cannot infiltrate the soil in the plot any longer, it will be funneled through this pipe right here into another tipping bucket rain gauge, so it measures the runoff, essentially, of a storm. It's very accurate for this, and also we have a rain gauge right here, so that just measures rainfall. So the difference between the value you get from the difference infiltrometer and the value you get from the rain gauge yields the infiltration capacity and rate. But fortunately, these only can collect data when it's storming. So to remedy this situation, we performed sprinkler experiments where we took about 2-gallon reservoirs and sprayed each plot at a consistent sprinkling rate, and we were able to generate data without relying on pesky rainfall. We recorded the elapsed time through every amount of water that was sprayed out, so 0.9 liters, and so that way we were able to determine the spray rate, and the rain gauge determined the amount of runoff. We got some really interesting results from this experiment. If you notice, just looking at it, they're pretty much opposite of each other. There was a sharp contrast. The vegetated plot soaked up water at 43 millimeters an hour. That is incredibly fast. So because we were sprinkling at like 50 millimeters an hour, because it was drinking up all this water, it was only able to produce 6 millimeters an hour of runoff. But the bare plot cannot suck any water up. So it only had 6 millimeters an hour, but since we were putting so much water on it, the runoff was 40 millimeters an hour. So very similar numbers. That was a really interesting find. Some conclusions we can draw from the results of this experiment are rainstorms with a 15-minute peak intensity, as the graphs I showed you previously, above 30 millimeters an hour, and 30-minute peak intensities with intensities at 20 millimeters an hour produce a flash flood. And storms with heavy rainfall that follow periods of no rainfall are most likely to produce flash floods. And the sprinkler experiment revealed bare areas are more likely to produce flash floods because of their low infiltration capacities seen from those really low numbers of 6 millimeters an hour. And the two implications that we can put to the test with these conclusions are that gully incision occurs mainly during the summer. So in the high intensity random rainstorms associated with summertime moist convective systems. So monsoonal climate conditions is where gully erosion would be most active. And the coolest thing I think we found from this experiment was the idea that gullying has self-enhancing feedback. So when initial gully incision created by a flash flood, it creates a steep slope where it's generally bare. So the runoff just goes right down the slope and creates even more aggressive gully erosion. So once it's started, it just picks up. Oh, I'm trying to move this one up. Do that. I'd like to thank Greg Tucker and Andy Wickert, who are my two main mentors assigned by RESESS, the Plains Conservation Center, which is where West Bijou Creek is located, and they were very kind to let us set up all these crazy contraptions on their land. I'd like to thank Aisha Morris and Melissa and Greg's grad students. I'm not going to list them all off, but thank you very much.
There we go. The self-enhancing gulling effect is really interesting, but also the vegetation.
Mm-hmm.
And I would imagine one of the implications of your study is the importance of revegetation as remediation for gullying. Would you concur that that's one of the key things that you've found there as well? Is that
what was the key thing?
If vegetation, in other words, putting in vegetation, if you want to remediate or prevent gullying, that was one of the very dramatic aspects of your work, and sounds like it would. If you want to prevent the gulling, that's the way to go, right?
Yeah, that can definitely be another implication. Just because of the root systems in vegetation, they just provide more pathways for the water to access. Mm-hmm. So yeah, according to this study, I can I can work with vegetated patches because like when a flood is going just down a valley, I mean, some water gets soaked up in the vegetation, and so it's not consistent throughout a valley.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
In your sprinkler experiment, were the slope angles of the two test sites the same, and do you think slope angle would drastically affect the absorption rate?
Yes, both plots were varying within, I think, like 2 degrees of each other of the slope. So that we were trying to make that as negligible as possible. I think the slope can play an effect in infiltration rate. For example, if the slope is very steep, water is less likely to infiltrate, whereas if it's a little more slopey, not rushing down a gully network, then it could play a part.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Okay, thank you.